All right, good morning, everybody. So, the next week on Jonah, and we're going to finish off the first chapter and then get, if not all the way through, mostly through chapter 2. So, the word of the Lord came to Jonah. That's the way this book starts. And it causes us, as I said last week, we have no idea how the word came, but it came to Jonah, and Jonah then has to decide what he's going to do. It's like all of us. When somebody calls me up and says, Mitch, do you want to, or you are to, I have to decide yes or no. Can I work it in? Now, chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, this terrified them. And they asked, what have you done? And they knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? So they've tried everything. They've lightened the load. They finally woke Jonah up. Call upon your God. We've been praying to our gods. You call upon your God. And Jonah goes, look, I worship the God who created the heavens and the earth. And finally, he admits, he says, look, it's me. And so they said, what do we have to do? Now, Jonah lived in a spiritual world. And the reason this is important is because the individuals who he's talking to have an understanding that there is someone or something out there that controls this. And no matter what they thought, whether it was a form of karma or of divine retribution or simply right and wrong, they're looking for something outside of themselves, which they can either make a sacrifice to or apologize to fix everything. And now that they've discovered that Jonah is the problem, so over the past 20 years, the death rate from drug poisonings in the US has tripled, and suicide and alcohol, liver disease death rates have increased by 30%, particularly among middle-aged white Americans, according to studies by the National Center for Health Statistics. Now, over the past 20 years, we've seen a dramatic rise in suicides, alcohol, liver disease, and drug poisonings, okay? And by the way, when they say drug poisonings, they mean a drug overdose, sometimes intentional, sometimes not. Further evidence shows that these dramatic changes in mortality rates within the American communities actually began in the late 20th century. But researchers have been unable to pinpoint the cause for these deaths of despair. Daniel Hungerman, professor of economics at the University of Notre Dame, which remember is a Catholic university, and his co-authors studied the connection between a sharp downturn of religious participation in the late 1980s and the swift rise of deaths of white Americans aged 45 to 54 in the early 1990s. Their findings were recently issued in a working paper by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Now, somebody saw two things and decided maybe they're related, so they did the research. Derek Thompson, who's an author for The Atlantic, this is what he found out. He says, and as an agnostic, I have spent most of my life thinking about the decline of faith in America in mostly positive terms. Organized religion seemed to me beset by scandal and entangled in noxious politics. So I thought, what is there really to mourn? So you've got a guy who's an agnostic, and he says, when the church started to spiral down due to its own problems, I was cheering it because what was possibly, how is this going to affect me? Now, this is where we start asking the question. The sailors on Jonah's ship lived in a spiritual world. We still live in a spiritual world. You ask most people no longer say they're Christian. Now they just say they're spiritual. And by that, they mean, I understand that there's some sort of a connection between all these things around me. I just don't know what it is. So Derek Thompson said, let me do some research. Only in the past few years have I come around to a different view. Maybe religion, for all of its faults, works a bit like a retaining wall to hold back the destabilizing pressure of American hyper-individualism, which threatens to swell and spill over in its absence. Going back then to the work by the individuals from Notre Dame. Turns out that there may be a point to the church beyond the Christian community. Most of us who are Christians, we hold to the church and we say the purpose of the church is this. And usually, by the way, it's about getting me to heaven. It's about creating and establishing and restoring relationships with God. But if we look back throughout the scriptures, we began to see that there is also another purpose to the church. The church, in spite of its fault, can be used by God to hold things together. Colossians 1:17, He, Christ, is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. Matthew 5:14, you are a light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. The church all of a sudden comes to light as something that actually has a benefit even to those who are not Christians. We don't always see that. But it's interesting because during every election, many, if not most of the candidates will end their speeches with, and God bless you and God bless America. They're pandering to the thought process that they want to pull the heartstrings of those who believe in God. And it's interesting because you will see this take place not just in politics, but also in business, where suddenly businesses, when they have a downturn, realize there is an untapped potential. And we're going to try to reach out to the church. How do we convince the church that we care about them, that we have a product that they need? And so we began to see that the church has a purpose in the world. The world doesn't always understand that purpose. And sometimes the world wants to use the church for things that God did not design it for. Jonah does what only one who is a sinner saint could do in such a situation. Jonah understands, simul justus et peccator. I am simultaneously a saint and a sinner. He is willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of those around him. What must we do to you in order to calm this raging storm? The sailors ask. Jonah answered them, pick me up, throw me into the sea so it may quiet down for you, for I know that I'm to blame for this violent storm that is against you. Wow. Can you imagine saying, it's my fault, and the only way to save yourselves is to kill me? Okay? This is very much like Abraham. I want you to go sacrifice your son. Go to the mountain I'm going to tell you about. I want you to take everything. I want you to sacrifice him. And it's real easy for us, because we know the whole story from beginning to end. It's real easy for us to say that Abraham knew that God wasn't going to do it. Or, as it says, God would bring Isaac back from death. Okay? It's easy for us. But that did not solve the problem of Abraham's conscience weighing heavily on him about sacrificing his son. Did Jonah know that God was going to save him? Did Jonah feel like somehow he wouldn't die? Did he know about the fish? All of these things. Yet he has the guts to say, you need to pick me up and throw me into the ocean. 113. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. The sailors are ignoring the obvious and suggested solution, and the author correlates the sea getting angrier with their attempts to save Jonah. In other words, the more they try to save Jonah, the angrier the sea gets. It's an interesting dilemma that could be easily the subject of a book. But we see this, and we look at it and we say, okay, the harder we try to save Jonah, the worse it's going to get for us. But can our consciences actually handle what he has suggested that we do? 114. Then they cried to the Lord, O Lord, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Lord, have done as you pleased. The sailors are caught between saving themselves and taking the life of another. If God is God and righteous, will he forgive them for what they now must do? Or, in order to save themselves, are they actually condemning themselves? If they throw Jonah overboard and the boat capsizes and they all drowned, was it worth it? And this is one of those catch-22s. And they were worshiping, they might have known about the Hebrew God. Some of them might have even been praying to him, but this is not the land of Jews, so it's also possible that they were worshiping dozens of other gods. But they have come to this moment, they have realized that Jonah has told them about his God, and now they say, okay, he says that you say we have to sacrifice him, but if we do so, what will be your response? Second, in 1 Samuel 24, David does not kill King Saul because he believed it would be wrong to harm the Lord's anointed king. Saul was trying to kill David. And by the way, he would not have hesitated. Had the situation been reversed, Saul would not have hesitated and he would have killed David. David's men even insist that he kill Saul. But instead, David simply cuts off a piece of Saul's robe to prove that he had been there and could have killed him. Now, I bring up 1 Samuel 24 because this is one of those where David has decided, God said that I would be king. This is a choice of God. But at the same time, Saul is still the king. And despite the fact that he's trying to kill me and that he's creating chaos in a country, I do not feel as I have permission to take his life because he's still the Lord's anointed one. And so he doesn't. And it obviously prolongs the suffering both of David as well as the people. And we have to ask these questions. If we are placed into a situation where our morals and ethics are going to be challenged, and the obvious answer to save ourselves is one thing, but our morals and ethics are pulling us in a different direction, which do we listen to? Chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. After their prayer, they took Jonah, threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. This is not an easy verse to understand. Why did they fear God? And this appears to be more a bit of a mix between being afraid but also respecting. What was the sacrifice other than Jonah? What did they have left on the boat that they could have offered as a sacrifice? And by the way, did they understand what the Hebrew sacrifices were and why they were? What kind of vows were they that they made? Did they remain faithful or just add God to their stable of gods? Hey, we've got a new God to worship, so the next time the boat's in trouble, we're going to skip these gods and go straight to this God. These are the questions because it simply says, all right, God, we're so sorry. Please don't kill us for taking the life of this man. They throw him overboard. The seas grow calm immediately according to this. They immediately sacrifice. They make vows to God. And then obviously they said sail for home. 117. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside that fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, dog or daga means fish. That's the word here. Imagine the sailors watching Jonah. The sea grows calm. There's hope for Jonah. In other words, hey, Jonah's out there, but the seas are calm. And, who knows? Maybe they threw him a barrel to float with. Who knows? But then all of a sudden, this giant fish appears and swallows him, and the fish disappears. All of a sudden, the story takes on a very strange turn. Now, remember, this is the end of the first chapter. We move on to the second. So the last thing in chapter 1 is the fish swallows Jonah. And we get a little bit of a preview. He's going to be inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Similar stories are found in various cultures, including the Aboriginal folklore of Australia. A great fish swallows a man who emerges with special knowledge and new powers, symbolizing a profound spiritual journey and I'm going to say reawakening rather than just an awakening. So the Aboriginal culture actually has a story of a guy who gets swallowed by a fish. And when he comes out of the fish, he has new powers and he has new knowledge. And he uses that knowledge and those powers. Ancient Korean petroglyphs at Bangui depict variations of a hero swallowed by a monster who undergoes a transformation. Although the exact story is lost to time, the petroglyphs show this individual swallowed by a giant fish and then somehow coming out. They just don't know fully what happened afterwards. So stories of somebody being swallowed by a fish and living, Jonah's not the only one. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Okay. So now we come to the question. If the word is dog or daga, meaning fish, why do we say whale? Because when we're in Sunday school, Jonah is swallowed by a whale. Okay. So I had to do some research. Jeremiah 51:34. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon has devoured me. He has crushed me. He has set me aside like an empty dish. He has swallowed me like a giant sea monster. He filled his belly with my delicacies. He has vomited me out. Job 3:8. Let those who curse certain days cast a spell on it, those who are skilled in rousing Leviathan. Okay? Matthew 12:40. For as Jonah was in the belly of a huge fish 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. Ketos, a huge fish. This is the Greek word, means a sea monster. Now, Leviathan is a sea monster, okay, in the Old Testament. It's actually used 8 times. The word dragon is used 12 times. Beast is used 99 times in 89 verses. And the word whale gets used exactly 0 times in the entire Bible. Okay? So we've got giant fish. We have dragon. We have Leviathan, which is a sea monster, and, but nothing about a whale. So in Sunday school, when we talk about a whale, was it because a whale is the easiest thing to tell a kid? Well, because what's the biggest fish you've ever seen? Because remember, whales are mammals. What's the biggest fish you've ever seen? Yeah. And sharks are also, they give birth to live young. But when the moment you see Jaws, you get an appreciation for how big sharks are. And you go, okay, but what is the actual biggest fish? And you go, well, sea bass and some of these things, they get to be large. But you're like, is there anything out there that's big enough to swallow me? Oh, and by the way, the stomach has to be big enough for me to fit inside the stomach and ride around for 3 days. And this is why everybody says, oh, well, it was obviously a whale. Okay, well, it's when we get to heaven, I'm sure God's got the home movies. We'll be able to watch it. Jonah 2:1. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. Now, Luther notes that it is highly unlikely that Jonah is as poetic as these verses make him sound, okay? He was inside a fish being digested by enzymes, had no idea how to get out. It was dark, smelly, slimy, and gross. And so I just don't see him saying, oh, blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe. I don't know about you, but if I was in the belly of a fish and it was pitch black and I was being digested and it was slimy and gross and there were fish up in my eyeballs and nose and everywhere else, I don't know that I would be able to, And by the way, if you've ever watched the VeggieTales, Jonah, the whale stomach is so big, by the way, that they're having a party in there. And if that was the case and you're sitting around and you can light a lamp and, it's basically like riding around in a little submarine, that would be a whole different idea. But I don't think that's what the scriptures are saying. Now, what would you say if you were in the belly of a fish and you were there because you ran away from God and you almost got a bunch of people killed? And these might be your last words. Would you be honest? Would you be funny? Would you be sarcastic? Would you be profound? How do you picture if you were placed into a situation where it was highly unlikely that you were going to get out? It's dark and you're there because of your own designs. In other words, you know that you're there because of something you did or didn't do. And you have the chance to leave behind a video, to leave behind a diary that you know will get to somebody. There's a book by one of my favorite authors, and I love it because this individual gets to go up into space in one of these things like um, Blue Origin or any of the others do. And you're supposed to go up, circle the earth a few times, and then come back down. Only when it goes up, a micrometeorite comes through, kills the pilot, and leaves the aircraft circling the earth. And the individual who's left alive, okay, at first he's trying to figure out how to get down. That doesn't work. And so finally, he starts doing a video. But he doesn't know that whereas he can't hear anybody, they can hear him. And so all of a sudden, as he is talking about the girl in third grade, the girl that he kissed in the seventh grade, the thing that he did that nobody knew that he did it and he feels bad, and all the things that he confesses and all his hopes and dreams, everybody in the world, kind of like the Truman Show, everybody is watching this. And it's creating quite the world, the stir in the world. And it's in there, it's an interesting thing because this individual, not knowing that anybody is able to see or watch or hear him, is pouring out his soul. And it turns out everybody is hearing him. And because of his honesty and because of his simplistic measure of doing this, it's changing lives. Jonah didn't know he was going to be rescued. I doubt he had pen and paper because remember back then, a little different. He obviously didn't have a video camera. So all of this gets written later after he has survived. And he's going back and he's remembering what he said. But if he's like a lot of people, I always, when I meet somebody and I say something, an hour later, I always know exactly what I should have said. And so Jonah's giving us a little bit of the truth, but also a little bit of, well, this is what I would have said had I been, well, a little more normal. So there were some theologians who saw Jonah being swallowed by a fish as a metaphor for death. There was no fish, or if there was, it killed him. Jonah was left in the darkness to figure things out. While we don't accept this, it brings about a good question. Why did God save Jonah? So when theologians were studying Jonah, they look at it and they say, it's like a lot of the other books. Nope, it's just a metaphor. It never happened. Jonah was never swallowed by a fish. It was just a metaphor for death, and then God brought him back to life. Or, yes, maybe he was swallowed by a fish, but it really wasn't being totally swallowed. And they come up with all these things because it's just too hard to believe that somebody could exist inside of a fish. So why did God do this? Why was this the chosen method? He could have done the Tom Hanks Castaway thing where, Jonah was just drifting around on a little life raft for days and days and days with the sun beating down on him and no food and no water and maybe sharks circling him around him. But God chose Jonah to be swallowed by a giant fish. And he chose him to go through this. And so we're looking at this. And whereas I do not believe that it is a myth, I do believe that it has some things that God wants us to see. In my distress, I called to the Lord and he answered me. From the depths of the grave, I called for help and you listened to my cry. It's very psalm-like. Jonah begins by praising God's mercy and help and thanking him for his deliverance from distress. In other words, I thought I was going to die when I got thrown over the boat, and then this fish swallowed me. He holds God's goodness up for us to see, and then his own need from which God helped him. And so this is a perfect psalm. Hey, God, I was at the end of my rope, thought I was going to die, and then I got swallowed by a fish. Okay? And it looks very, very simplistic and yet very praiseworthy. We do not know if he is thanking God for the fish or if these words were penned after he exited the fish or if faith he believes he's going to be saved either by exiting the fish or by exiting the world. Jonah's prayer teaches two lessons. First, we above all else pray and cry to God in times of adversity. Second, God will answer us when we cry to him. I only talk to people who I think are listening. Sometimes I talk to myself because I need to hear myself out loud. But I'm not going to pray if I don't think there's no one to hear me. And so when Jonah begins to pray, it's because no one else can help him. My last resort. I can talk to the fish, but I don't know that the fish is going to listen. And so the only thing I can do is talk to God. Verse 2 or chapter 2 verse 3, you hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the current swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. Jonah reveals his emotions. His faith was challenged, his hope fading. He does not blame the sailors. Thou, O God, didst cast me into the deep. You, God, hurled me into the deep. It wasn't the sailors. I mean, he could have very quickly gone on, hey, God, those guys threw me into the water. It was there, but he doesn't. He understands why he's there, and he understands that it was God that put him there. Psalm 42:7, deep calls to deep in the roar of the waterfalls. All your breakers and your billows have swept over me. David, Jonah is actually copying him, something that you would expect from a prophet. Why reinvent the wheel? If somebody has said something that you have committed to heart because it is something that you're feeling, why would you say something new? And so you simply quote David. Hey, God, I'm going to use the words of David from a long time ago because I think they're appropriate right now. Chapter 2, verse 4. I said, I've been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. Jonah fled from God, and now he feels as though God is fleeing from him, abandoning him to what he chose and what he deserves. But hope is not lost. I will look again toward your holy temple. And Jonah waits to see if God is looking back, the prodigal son. He's not going to ask the fish to turn toward the temple. This is not a physical, I'm looking. This is God. I am looking to the place where if I were still on land, I could sacrifice and know that you would forgive me. But this is what I'm going to do. Again, Jonah appears to be quoting or paraphrasing King David, this time from Psalm 31:22. In my alarm, I had said, I am cut off from your sight, but you heard the sound of my pleading when I cried for you for help. Psalm 51. Then I will teach transgressors your ways. There is a cry for help, and the cry for help is followed up by, if you forgive me, if you restore me, then things will change. 2:5. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. Now, before the fish arrived, he was drowning. And he describes it in such a way, seaweed wrapped around his head. In other words, there is so much seaweed that it literally is keeping him from swimming, from floating. It started to wrap itself around him. And he's looking at it. He's saying, God, I thought maybe there was hope. I thought when they threw me out and the water's calm, maybe it was going to be okay. So here are the stages of drowning. The person inhales water and starts coughing, okay? This causes spasms in the lungs. Then they try to hold their breath, okay? They try to hold it because they don't want it. So they when they come up, they take a breath and then they hold it. But eventually they can't do it because the water's tossing them around. It goes in the nose or they have to take water enters the lungs. Lack of oxygen to the brain leads to a loss of consciousness. The heart and lungs cease functioning and you die. Okay? The simplistic thing about drowning. It's interesting because when I watch all these movies and somebody says they want to die, and I've watched way too many where they say, I just am going to go out into the water and die peacefully. It's not a peaceful death. Drowning is not. But here's the psychological aspect, the fear and panic, which often causes someone to open their mouth and scream. And the moment they open their mouth, water gets in. And if it's salty water, it's something that exacerbates the coughing and the spasms. Then you have a loss of control. In other words, no matter what I do, I can't fix it. And then the panic just begins to spiral. Near-death experiences and psychological events often take place. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because as Jonah tells God what's going on, we see the reality of it and the truth of it when we compare it to what we know about individuals who have come back from drowning. And they said, this is what I felt, and this is what was going through me. So one of our church members, back shortly after World War II, he was with the UDT team that eventually became the Navy SEALs. He was doing an exercise off of Maui along with a bunch of other UDT divers. He got separated from the group. He was in the water for 24 hours, didn't have any flotation gear, just his suit. And by accident, a Navy destroyer that had given up the search and was headed back to port spotted him and saved him. So I was talking to him about this event, and he was sharing with me what it was like. And he said, I just kept envisioning something, anything coming over the horizon that would see me. And I was like, but Phil, you're wearing a black wetsuit with a black hood and a mask. And he said, yeah, I know. But he said, I just kept telling myself something was going to come to my rescue. And by the way, the only way they saw him was his face mask reflected light. And somebody caught a flash of light. And I'm like going, and how did they differentiate that from all the white caps? But somebody saw it, and he was rescued. Chapter 2, verse 6, to the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. The roots of the mountains are a metaphor for the depths of the sea. In other words, he was in deep water. He was so deep there was no hope. It was a pit of water. But just as he was about to give up, God rescues him. We have a couple of individuals who used to be lifeguards out at Disney Aulani. And their job, of course, was to walk around, and they have their big life buoys that they carry with them. And they said once in a while, somebody would get topsy-turvy. They would be inhaling water. They would be spitting and coughing. And the first thing they have to do is tell the people, stand up, because the water's not all that deep. If they're an average sized person, they just stand up. Okay. If they're a little kid, not going to happen. But if they're an adult, and this is one of those things, that once in a while you have to remind people the water is not that deep. Stand up. Oh, I'm fine. Jonas goes, the water was so deep that I was going to go down to the depths. It was the pit that King David kept talking about, except my pit was not slime or darkness. My pit was water. 2:7, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Now it's out of sequence, but it's expected. At some point, Jonah realized God could save him, and he prayed specifically. Now, before this, he was waiting for God to save him. He kept saying, I kept waiting for you. I was talking to you, God. But at some point, he actually said, God, save me. And he points this out. And like I said, it's out of sequence, but it's that point where we realize as when we are going through, and one of the reasons that I love some of the books in the scriptures is because when they start making connections here and there, and this time it's the book of James, you have not because you ask not. And when we hear that, you have not because you ask not, we realize that once in a while, and it's not like God is withholding it from us, but sometimes when we finally say, I need or I would like, there's somebody who's like, well, it just so happens I have one of those and I don't need it. Would you like it? In this case, Jonah cries out, God, save me. In 2:8, those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. 1 Corinthians 15:19, if we have put our hope in Christ for this life only, we should be pitied more than anyone. Hope cannot be in hope. Hope and faith are only good, and they're only as good as what the hope and the faith is in. This is why, by the way, when we do a children's message once in a while, we hold up a dollar bill and we say, how much is it worth? And they all say it's worth $1. But that doesn't mean anything. So a few weeks ago, I mentioned to you that I have some McDonald cups from the 90s, and I have a prime Larry Bird cup. And yesterday I was waiting for the video to compile, and so I just decided to type it in. There are people selling those cups on eBay for $12. This is a McDonald's cup that is 30 years old, and they're selling it for $12 because it has Larry Bird's picture on it. And by the way, just so you know, I also have one with Michael Jordan's picture on it. In fact, I have like 5 of them. And all of a sudden you're looking at it. And so, but I was laughing because not only were they selling it for $12, somebody bought it for $12 and gave it a glowing review. And I wanted to find that person and say, I'll sell you all of them for nothing. You pay the shipping. But this is why when we say, how much is a dollar worth? It's worth whatever you're willing to sell me it for. I may have an inflated view or a deflated view. And so when we put our hope in Christ, as Paul said, if all we have is hope, and we're just going, Jesus is my Savior, Jesus is going to take care of me, but there is no Jesus, then we are to be pitied more than everybody else who's ever existed and everybody who will exist. Jonah says, those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. And whether he's specifically talking about the sailors on the ship or whether this is just maybe the Ninevites or others, he says, I knew that what I had put my hope and faith in was real. And he's not necessarily saying that those who do not have a real God to hope and trust in, it's not like he's not making fun of them. He's just saying, I understand that my hope and my faith actually means something. And if it weren't for God, that moment, by the way, I would have had no hope. Chapter 2, verse 9. But I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good, for salvation comes from the Lord. Somewhere Jonah made a promise to God. He repented and agreed to go to Nineveh, and whether salvation, the salvation is referring to himself or the people of Nineveh or both, we're going to have to see. But he says, okay, God, I learned my lesson. I'm going to make a sacrifice to you. And the vow I made to you, I'll keep it. And of course, what that means is it's quite likely that some of the other vows that he made, he either didn't keep or hadn't planned on keeping. But this one he says, because you rescued me, I'm going to keep the vow. And it's interesting because since we know how it ends, it does kind of point to the fact that Jonah's vows weren't always kept, because he keeps it not because he wants to, but because he has to. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah out onto dry land. I love the imagery here. But it's unlikely that the moment Jonah prays, the fish vomits him up. 3 days and 3 nights. While it could have been a metaphor for holy, Jesus uses it as a clock for his own story. And so he looks at it, and it sounds like it means 3 days, 3 24-hour days. And so this is the way it's going to be. Also, how close would a whale have to get to vomit you up on shore? And this is where we can go down the rabbit hole and lose sight of what Jesus is trying to teach us. We also don't know that there was this prayer and immediately the whale vomited him up or the fish vomited up on shore, or whether it was, okay, you're going to have to spend some more time in here, but I think you're on your way home. Whether God whispered in his ear and says, it's okay, just give the fish some time. He's got to get you near shore. Now, after it vomits him up, what do you think Jonah looked like? Emmy, I'm going to ask you, if I was embedded in a enzyme that was dissolving my flesh for 3 days, what would I look like? Yeah, not good. What did you think he smelled like? Man, I'll tell you, I used to go fishing with my grandpa, and just playing with fish made my hands smell for days, no matter how many times I washed them. And how do you think his time in the fish changed both his attitude and his message? I mean, this is something, the moment that I start to get punished for something as a child, go to your room. I would wait like 3 minutes and come out and say, is it time yet? And my mom would say, go back to your room. It's like, no, no, I learned my lesson. And my mom was like, it doesn't matter. I need quiet time. Go back to your room. And I understood, but I didn't want to be in my room because back then we didn't have TV, internet, computers. There was nothing to do in your room except like read and do homework. It was like, oh, that was punishment. But you look at it and you find yourself saying, 3 days and 3 nights. What would his attitude been? How would this change the message? Not that just he would preach to the Ninevites, but that would change the way that he preached forever. Over the years, we've had a number of individuals who had some pretty amazing stories. Dave and Barb Anderson were here. They survived the plane crash in the Bering Sea. Um, Don Wharton, who was also in the plane with them, he was here. They talk about what it was like clinging to empty gas cans, hoping that somebody will come rescue them, even though they're freezing because the water is so cold. We've had others that have come in here and told their story, and it shaped not just the way that they told that story, but it shaped the way that they told all of their stories because something happened that was so profound that it changed the way they thought. It changed the way they felt. And so no matter what they wrote or sang or did, it flavored it. It's kind of like we were saying, when you take some sort of flavoring and add it to meat or chicken or even to a salad, it flavors the whole salad, not just even though it was just a few flakes, it flavors everything. While I believe the story is true, I also see it as a metaphor. Fort Wayne didn't teach this, the seminary I went to, but St. Louis does. It's called typology. Typology is when a biblical story tells a larger story of salvation. It mirrors Jesus. So when we look at the story of Jonah, Jesus says, hey, just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And so Jesus draws this parallel between himself and Jonah. But also we see, hey, you need to go and preach to these people. And Peter goes, nope, they're Gentiles. I am pure, and I don't want to become impure because I'm hanging out with them and eating the wrong foods. So every time when we're seeing these stories, there's pieces of the story that retell this story or prognosticate a story that's going to be told. And when we see this, we begin to put them together, just like when Jonah was, well, retelling a little bit of King David's story. And so typology is when we see a story that's telling a story, that's telling a story, that's telling a story, because the story is our story. It's the truth of us. And as we find that taking place in Jonah, we begin to look for this. Jonah didn't die, but he was resurrected in a very real way. The Ninevites, who didn't even know or care, are saved because somebody brings them the word. When we began to see these things, we start pointing. And so if we could just circle the book of Jonah, and then we start drawing arrows to other places in the entire Bible where we see pieces of Jonah fitting in here, there, and everywhere. The sailors saying, now we get it. We're going to make a sacrifice to God. Hey, God, don't hold this against us if we throw him overboard. We start seeing and finding how all of these things interrelate with all the other stories in the Bible, not because they're copying, but because there is an absolute truth that can be found, and it is the foundation that everything else is built on. All right, next week we will pick up with chapter 3. And so if you get a chance, read that before we get there. Aloha, ahui ho.